Well, y'all can call this lecture in your notes the corporations and railroading as a big business. And so where we are today as we get into this lecture, what we're going to look at is the growth of corporations in the United States in the post-Civil War era. First things first, corporations existed prior to the Civil War in the United States. Corporations, there's nothing magical about the Civil War other than it's not quite artificial, but it is a dividing line between obviously 1301 for a history course and 1302 for our course. The thing is that the Civil War does act as a nice dividing line between the early American period and the modern American period. So, but everything after the Civil War seems to be this, you really see the modern America emerging, and really one of the most fundamental aspects of this emergent America is in the corporation, and most especially in this case, the railroad. But we got to get some basic concepts out of the way and some basic understandings of corporations first before we get into the railroading industry itself. So we start with the large, and then we're going to come back to the more immediate. First things first, obviously we need to understand why there would be individuals and why the country would be in favor of adopting corporate models and corporate practices in the larger economy. Some of it is by just evolution, or some of it's just by adoption coming from England. In other cases, it'll be just simply the fact is that it's just legally advantageous. So I guess this first part you can call in your notes, these are the reasons for, or these are the positives of a corporation. Something that we deal with all the time, even if we don't quite think about it. Now, so what are the positives to a corporation? Here's number one. First things first about a corporation is that it is a person in the eyes of the law. You need to write that down. And that's going to sound strange because we think of corporations as just creatures of the legal code, or creatures of business, or just simply business. I mean, whether it's a big corporation like a Amazon or a Walmart or something much smaller, corporations are legal entities, LLCs, LPs, and so on and so on and so on. But more importantly for us today, and this is a big thing to remember, is that corporations are persons in the eyes of the law. It is a fundamental fact going back into the 1880s. I believe it was 1881, but a Supreme Court case involving railroads, the Southern Pacific particularly, talked about in just a footnote. One of the justices in this footnote of a majority opinion said, it's just understood amongst us justices that corporations enjoy the rights of a person. Or, and say it a little differently, corporations have civil rights. You may not think that's a big deal, but it frankly is. Now, when we think of civil rights, you may think immediately of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and so on. Can a corporation have religion? Not exactly, but at the same time, in 2020 terminology, which would have been, say, in the last half decade or so, you'll see court cases basically coming out that say corporations do have civil rights in the religious sense, meaning that they can, a corporation can assert its religious identity. And of course, that comes from the founder in all likelihood. Or you will go back further in American legal history, say in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, you'll see the Supreme Court assert and reaffirm the idea that a corporation has free speech rights. And we wouldn't think that a free speech right would be applied to a corporation, but it can be and is by the courts. In that, if the federal government, meaning the Congress, wanted to pass a law that said corporations cannot endorse a candidate, corporations cannot spend money in a political way, meaning Walmart Political Action Committee cannot give thousands of dollars to I guess you could say to the elect Joe Biden campaign or the reelect the president campaign, whichever you want. But they can't. There was what's called Citizens United, allows corporate donations to PACs and allows them to have a political voice. But really where this idea of corporations having a set of civil rights, having the Bill of Rights apply to them, and being viewed as a person in the eyes of the law is this fundamental and extraordinarily important thing, and that is the issue of due process. due process under the law. And when we talk about due process, basically in a nutshell means is that in this case a corporation cannot be denied, cannot be deprived of its property or its possessions without the due process and the courts adjudicating the decision of, say, a regulator to break up, say, a Walmart or a Microsoft or somebody else in time. They have due process rights just like you and I would have if we were to be charged with a crime or even in a civil forfeiture sort of way. Civil rights is a big one, and it protects the corporations and it protects businesses, generally speaking now. It protects businesses from, say, populist governments or progressive governments that might want to score points or try to remake society in its own image. And it does give judicial protection to businesses, especially corporations in this case right here. So number one, an advantage of a corporation is simply that the issue of civil rights. Number two, here's a second advantage a corporation possesses over mom and pop or a small concern or small business, and that is the issue of life and death. Corporations don't die. Now, obviously, they can go into receivership. Some of you may have grandparents probably who are 65, 70, 75 years old who have been lamenting lately the death of or the closure, likely closure of Luby's, or say Fuddruckers or something like that. Maybe you've got some grandparents or great-grandparents who are saying, oh my gosh, I remember back when I was a kid. We used to go and get a Luann platter and used to have liver and onions and this, that, and the other at Luby's. Oh, how wonderful Luby's was. Now, maybe none of you on this call or none of you watching this video would say, oh yeah, I remember the fond days of Luby's, because you never ate there because your folks didn't take you, and you wouldn't know Luby's from a Jack in the Box or whatever. But corporations can close. But for those who do not suffer from time passing them by, to use a term, those who are still relevant and still can make money and still can stay in business, the corporation perpetuates. It's, in a sense, self-perpetuating. Use, for example, Walmart, just right down the road from most of you, somewhere along the route. Walmart was started by a fellow named Sam Walton, W-A-L-T-O-N, Sam Walton. Now, Sam Walton has been dead for nearly 30 years at this point in time. He died of bone cancer in the early 1990s. But it was Sam Walton who established and created Walmart, but yet Walmart, since the death of Sam Walton, has gotten bigger, expanded further, and on we can go. Many of y'all go shopping at Walmart, whether it's online or in the old store, however you do it. The second example would be the Apple. The Apple Corporation. Most of you, I'm going to guess, probably have an Apple iPhone. Maybe a few of you are Android, but and I'm not here to argue and fight over the glories of Android versus the evils of iPhone or vice versa. But when you talk about Apple, who was it that created the Apple Corporation? Who is it most associated with Apple? And of course, his name is Steve Jobs. Some of you know that. Maybe most of you know Steve Jobs. He's been dead, 8 years, 10 years now, something like that? But maybe 5. But point is this: Jobs was the brainchild behind Apple. It was Jobs who very famously, toward the end of his life, and I've got my iPhone sitting right here. Let me see if I get it in the screen. I've got my iPhone sitting right here, but it was Jobs who understood intuitively the first prototype of the iPhone was not that good. He played with it. He felt it. He felt all over it and messed with it. And he's like, no, there's these issues here. Send it back with these corrections. And his engineers brought back the second version, as I understand the basic story. He looked at it, felt it, and the iPhone was blessed by Steve Jobs. And of course, we're on iPhone 25 and a half or something like that at this point in time. I say that with sarcasm, but we're about the iPhone 11, 12, SE. I couldn't tell you. Somebody just type in the most current version that we have at this point in time. But the thing is that Apple continues, and that's really my point. Just like Walmart continues, and nameless and numberless, in a sense, other corporations that survive the death of the founder. Whereas small mom and pop businesses, say one like in LaGrange, Texas, Preisel's, I think it is, meat market and barbecue joint in LaGrange. appraisals or appraisals or something like that, their family got old. Family decided they didn't want to do it, and the family has shut it down and sold it. So it has changed hands, in a sense, is closed. But Walmart continues on. So that's a big thing. The idea of basically surviving the death of the founder doesn't mean it always turns out well, because sometimes the founder was the real genius behind the operation, in addition to being an executor. So sometimes they survive and sometimes they thrive, even in the absence of the founder of the corporation. Something else worth noting about corporations: they have lots of money. They have the ability to raise lots of money, and that's another important facet of corporate life that's worth noting. Obviously stocks, obviously bonds. Not just what you sell, but stocks and bonds. And when I talk about railroading here today and in the next lectures, you'll hear me raise that issue about stocks and bonds, especially the issue of buying bonds in a corporation that you want to build through your town. So you're supporting, you're capitalizing, as it were, the corporation. And in this case, for the railroads. But they can raise goodly amounts of money. And in that sense, it plays to a fourth aspect that they have at their advantage and disposal over top of mom and pop, is that corporations have the ability to plow millions of dollars, in some cases, if it's big enough, billions of dollars in 2020 money, into research and development. You find a lot of research and development done by mom and pop operations, but it's really pushed forward, it seems like, in the modern sense, by these companies that can really plow money in and then turn something around, develop a vaccine, a medicine or something. I'm thinking pharmaceuticals, frankly, and then sell it, of course, making money and also paying for failed projects. So research and development is big. The ability to raise capital is big, meaning raise money is big. There's another facet, too, to the advantage of a corporation. Put this in your notes, is the issue of cost. Corporations sometimes can be accused of, especially when they become monopolistic, they can be accused of gouging and hurting small business and running people out of business, and that can be true. Small towns in Texas and many other states where Walmart moved into in the 1980s and 90s, it was said that when Walmart moved in, mom and pop in downtown died. And I look at Faith over there, but who's from New Braunfels. Probably, though, in the day when I was a boy, well before Faith was born and moved to New Braunfels, downtown New Braunfels was hurting because of Walmart having sucked business to Walmart in the early days. Now, New Braunfels is a city of close to 100,000 people now, or maybe even over. It's a bigger town. But if you've got family who's live in smallish towns, downtown square or the old business district was forever changed when a Walmart type store opened. But all that to say, though, is that Walmart offered something mom and pop could not, which is cheaper prices and, frankly, a lot of convenience. You go into Walmart, you can buy a spark plug for your mower, gas additives for your mower, milk for yourself, food, clothes, whatever. It's the giant general store. And even in a greater sense, arguably today, is that Amazon would be a similar sort of convenience / cost factor. Now, Amazon is not the cheapest in everything, and some of you probably have looked around on Amazon over the years and said, boy, I could get this cheaper here, here, or here. But there is that convenience factor. So one of the complaints about corporations is the issue of their price gouging. But there's also an equally, I think, even greater case to be made that one of the benefits of a corporation is, frankly, economy of scale and cheaper prices that mom and pop could never touch. But to switch my gears, and this is not designed to be an absolutely exhaustive cataloging of corporations' advantages and disadvantages, but it is designed to kind of give you the idea that these things are facts of life and they really come into their own in the 19th century. On the negative side, of course, is when you talk about corporations and what they do wrong, you can certainly point to corruption. You can point to the corruption. In the sense not so much as corrupting the campaign for president so much. I don't really buy that nearly as much as other, say, progressives do. But what I would say the corruption would be, particularly for the 19th century where we're at in this course, It would be corruption in the sense of the bribing of politicians, the bribing of senators, the bribing of congressmen, and on we can go. These congressmen, these senators, these governors, they all know that they hold the purse strings, and they all know that they, in a sense, have a veto power over top of where you lay a railroad track, for example. So what ends up happening is that these businesses will slip money under the table, as it were, to the corporation, or rather to the politician, and there becomes this relationship, very cozy, very well lubricated. Another way to say it is that it's amazing to me how legislators and congressmen can have spectacular financial returns on their investments. It's amazing that they can make 200 and 300% a year. It's glorious. But you and I probably can't. Anyways, there is a corruption factor there. So I would say bribery would be the easiest way to say corruption, bribery in a simplistic sense. Another problem with a corporation would be the monopoly issue. Clearly, when you talk about a Standard Oil, and they're I think a mixed bag. But when you talk about Standard Oil, and we'll talk about them in a later lecture, is that if you look at Standard Oil of the late 19th and early 20th century, you see Standard Oil driving men out of business as they become more monopolistic. And then also you'll see them raise prices at times, and at times not actually as well. But monopolistic practices, driving out your opponents, driving out of business your business enemies, if you want to use that term. But that's certainly there. And when you talk about the downside of a corporation, even the fall of mom and pop would be a gutting of a community, particularly. And so what was once mom and pop and local, and I know Joe, and he works and he sells refrigerators. Yes, they're more expensive, but once you can go get a refrigerator at a Home Depot, well, Joe goes out of business, and what does he do? So you can, in a sense, rip at the social fabric, and it causes some real issues. Something else to put in your notes too is that working for a corporation can be extremely boring. And I'm looking over here at y'all on the Zoom call, but I bet some of you probably have worked for a corporation, maybe a Home Depot or a Lowe's or something of that nature. Maybe a restaurant or whatever. But some of you probably have, and you have done the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over, day after day. Mind-numbingly boring. It's a trouble. So anyways, those are just some ideas and some things we notice when we talk about the railroading business. One other, I got to put them both in here. One of the things you'll also hear said, and it's sometimes true and sometimes not, it has to do with labor and pay. Labor and pay. A corporation, on the positive side, a corporation can pay more. If you have a skill, and if you have a particularly unique skill that a business or an industry wants, congratulations, it's time to do that. You're going to get that. If you have, especially in a 2020 sense or a modern sense, you have strong, willing hands and a strong back, your value is a lot less. But even in the 19th century, where we are as a course, or in the early 20th century, you had value in strong hands and willing backs. But it's always the case that if you have a skill to sell, if you have a skill to trade for, meaning trade for the compensation, you could do a lot better. And corporations have the ability to pay far more than mom and pop. However, though, it's also fair to say, too, is that you will see during the 19th and through a large portion of the 20th century, up until the Roosevelt administration, the Franklin Roosevelt administration, you will see corporations continually hammering away to, at times, lower wages, even for those who seemingly have some skills. Not just the unskilled labor, but those who with skills. So at the one hand, on the positive, you get paid well if you have something to trade. On the other hand, if you don't really have as much to trade, you kind of are left at the tender mercy of a cold calculating accountant in the corporate office. So those are some last thoughts on the subject. But let's go ahead and switch now to the railroads. And we're going to talk about it in some of the most basic ways, and then we're going to build out from there on the railroading industry. The railroad itself begins prior to the Civil War. Railroading is found first in England, but it comes to the Americas in the 1820s and especially in the 1830s. For example, Andrew Jackson was inaugurated president in 1829, and Jackson will leave office in 1837. And when he came to office and came to Washington in 1829, Jackson rode into Washington on the back of a horse. And when Jackson leaves office as president in 1837, he leaves in a railroad car. In just that time period, Washington and Baltimore and New York and Philadelphia had started to become linked by this rail traffic. So railroads are going to play a major part of our history. Let's start with the very basics. Very, very basics. Just consider the fact that I know some of you probably live close to the railroad track there in College Station. Some of you may have an apartment. Some of you are just shaking your head yes, and it wakes me up at 2 a.m. as they blow the whistle and horn, and you would think, what on earth did I do to deserve this? No one told me about this when I signed up for the lease. But when we talk about building track, we're going to start with the very basics. We're going to build track and lay these tracks out. First things first, you've got to have the rails themselves. One of the things that's worth noting too, and I'll really explain this more later in a latter lecture when I get to the Carnegie boys, or Carnegie, is that you're going to start to see the establishment and the use of high-quality iron and then more especially high-quality steel ribbon rail. The rails that you see today are descendants of that Bessemer process that we'll go into some detail about in a later lecture. But the rails themselves, if you look at them, first things first, and you see them sitting on the track and you're stuck at Holloman or you're stuck at George Bush and you're thinking, why on earth am I stuck here? And by the way, I'll tell you why that track's there in a bit. The thing is that I'm going to ask you the question is, how wide is that track? And the answer should be, for your notes, the answer should be 4 foot 8.5 inches. 4 foot 8.5 inches, which is about as strange of a sizing as you could imagine. 4 foot 8.5 inches. Why not 6 foot? Why not 7 foot? Why not 8 foot? And the reality is that there's this story is probably apocryphal, which basically means that it might have happened the way I described it, or it might not have happened the way I described it. So, and I'm not trying to be evasive here. It's just sometimes we think we know, and then you teach the class or you write the book, and you say, okay, you kind of hedge. The 4 foot 8.5 inches came from the Romans. Those early engineers, those early builders of railroads knew their history. And a lot of them looked to the past and said, who are we emulating? Who are we, in a sense, consciously emulating? And if you think of the Romans and you only think of, say, the movie Gladiator from 20 years ago, or you only think of the Romans as warriors, that would be incorrect and frankly would short them quite a bit of history, because the Romans were some of the greatest engineers, meaning some of the greatest builders in all of the history of man. You think of the Colosseum. You think of some of the other, the Roman aqueducts, the roads, it said all roads lead to Rome sort of thing. And on you can go. Those great buildings and edifices, some of which still stand today. But when the army moved, or when the people moved, it was said they traveled in the chariots. So you'll hear the reason for 4 foot 8.5 inches. It actually comes from England, but they got theirs from Rome, and so we adopted it as well. The story I tell, and you can put this in your notes this way, you may find a variation off of this, and it's fine because it's probably apocryphal, but we know it's probably the Roman, and the thinking is that it is the width of the chariot hubs, hub to hub, the hub of the wheel sort of thing. 4 foot 8.5 inches, a Roman chariot. I've seen it also described that was the width of the average or the standard Roman wagon, 4 foot 8.5 inches. So that was why. Ultimately, had things been different, had they had a little more foresight when they built the railroads. The thing is that C-H-A. Hang on a second here. So the fact of the matter is that if they had thought a little bit better, they would have widened that out to 6 foot inches or 6 foot inches, 6 foot or 8 foot, something wider. It had been able to carry more tonnage. But 4 foot 8.5 inches it is. So next time you're over there waiting in a train, you know that. So the thing too is that if you're going to build tracks, you need lumber, lots and lots of lumber. Think about that. You need all those railroad ties. And if you've ever been to a town called Somerville, please write that in your notes. I'm going to use it a couple of times. In fact, actually, let me bring y'all over here and get you in front of me and move this over here. But if you're talking about Somerville, I think Mr. Youngman is still here. Mr. Youngman, you still here?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so Mr. Youngman here is from the big city of Caldwell, which is right down the road from Somerville. And Mr. Youngman could probably tell you there's something unique about Somerville. And the fact is it smells like a skunk's rear end.
Like mothballs.
It smells like mothballs. And the thing is Somerville is what you smell is creosote. Beautiful, glorious creosote. Now, the problem with the creosote is it can also give you cancer, but that's another story for another time, sort of thing. And there was some discussion about that about a decade ago. Was there a cancer outbreak in Caldwell because of the tie plant? Maybe so, maybe not. But anyways, Somerville is a town because of the railroad, and more especially because of that tie plant. But some of the ties that are used in the earliest days of building railroads around the turn of around the Civil War and right afterwards, they're not creosoted. They're not treated. They are just literally basically trees that have been cut and split in half, and they lay the track on top. Where I'm going with this is very important now. You have a rough track. You have a rough track, and it bucks and pitches like a bull almost, or a bronc or something of that nature. Most trains in the early days did not have rocker or riprap underneath them, so it was the train itself rode on the flat ground and rode on top of the rails that were on the flat ground. And then it would get muddy and it would become even more rocky as well. The trains themselves, now let's move on. Let's talk a little further. So 4 foot 8.5 inches is your standard gauge. The average train back in the 19th century was much, much shorter. The average train today is at least half a mile long, and frankly, especially if you're on certain lines that are really, really good, these trains can end up being 1 mile to 2 miles long. Some of you have watched the trains go by endlessly in College Station, and you're wondering, how long is it? Well, in the modern sense, 1 mile or longer. But in the 19th century, they only were about 8 or 9 or 10 cars long. And the reason being is several-fold. Number one, tracks weren't that good. Already said that. Number two, another reason you don't have long trains is because it was pulled by a steam engine. Those steam engines, worth noting now, those steam engines aren't that strong in the early days. They are frankly fairly weak. And number three, those trains were hard to stop. You've all heard the statement basically is the train can't stop. If you're on the track, it's not going to stop for you because it'll hit you. He can't stop. It was true then, and it's true now. So these trains are pulled by weaker engines that need a lot of water, and it makes a lot more sense, and it's just a lot safer for them to be short. So the thing to remember too about working for the railroad and on the railroad is that it is a dangerous, dangerous job. And I think you best write that in your notes. It is a dangerous job. And it's not just enough to say dangerous. But at, say, 1900, 1910, all through those first years of the 20th century, more than 5,000 men, almost all of them men, in fact, basically all of them men, but in those first years of the first decade of the 20th century, there will be at least 5,000 fatalities on the railroad each year. 5,000 people will lose their lives working for the railroad. Today, it would be a national scandal. Back then, not so much. So the thing is that and when you talk about the working for the railroad, it was hard. It was tough. It was disagreeable. I am getting some feedback from somewhere. So when it comes to working for the railroad, there are jobs and then there are jobs. If you had a death wish, if you really did not want to, if you really were determined to work on the railroad, and it would cost you potentially a lot to work for it, the most dangerous of the jobs is the brakeman. Working as a brakeman. Of all the jobs, it was the brakeman. Why the brakeman? Well, as the name implies, you stop the train. On these trains of the 19th and early 20th century, you're going to have two brakemen on the train. So what does the brakeman do? So when the engineer who pulls the throttle and makes the train go, when the brakeman is when the smoke signal is sent up, or actually more particularly the whistle toots or screams, you're going to see a brakeman get on top of the train on the front side where the engine is and on the back side where the caboose is. And these two brakemen will get up on top of the train and they will start walking to and or running towards each other. And on every car there is a wheel, and the brakemen take a tool and they spin that wheel down, tie off the brake, and then they run and they jump to the next car and do it all over again. So run, jump, and so forth. So, go with me on this. What's it like to go running along the top of a moving train? Are these trains just gliding smoothly along the path? And of course they're not. These trains are bucking and pitching. If you've ever heard of the term running boards, and say you put running boards on your pickup truck, or your boyfriend does, or you've got them on your own truck or whatever, the thing is that running boards, that comes from the railroading industry itself. One of the advantages of a railroad over top of, say, canals and river boats and other forms of transportation is this important fact. Please put this in your notes. They run in all types of weather. Pretty much everything from this side of a massive hurricane or a tornado, railroads can run in. And they can run in the night, they can run in the daytime, they can run in the rain, they can run in the ice and the sleet and the snow. Now imagine back to the brakeman. Just imagine if you are traveling, you're traveling along, you've got to stop the train, something's going on, it's in the middle of the night. And all of a sudden, brakeman is spelled B-R-A-K-E, the brakemen, these brakemen, plural, are running along the top in the nighttime, and they can see with their lantern, these dimly lit lanterns, they can see the gaps, and so they jump. But just imagine if you are running along and it is sleeting or has been sleeting. Or more particularly, you're running along and it's in the middle of the night, and maybe the company you work for doesn't have a lot of money, actually. And so what they end up doing is that they didn't trim the brush back far enough. Maybe the trees aren't high enough. And you're standing on top of this train, and all of a sudden a limb you didn't see comes by and hits you and knocks you off the top of the train, breaks your neck, and kills you. Some of you are looking like, oh my, that's quite a grisly tale. It is. So next thing, though, that also makes the brakeman's job very difficult, please put this in your notes, is that he also has to hook the train up. Just think about it from some of you who've got family members who have old trailers or something, and you've got to hook up what would be a Haspin pin set. And you drop the pin through, and it hooks up like so. Maybe it's an old shop-made trailer. All of which is to say is that if you look at the railroads and the cars back at around the turn of the 20th century and before, they had a link of chain, and it's called a link and pin system. A link of chain and a pin, and through a hasp, and you drop it through. And you get your hands out of there real quick. So the engineer who's backing the train up, and as you're coupling the cars up, can't see you. And as you've got your hands in there, you're going to get your hands caught. A brakeman, for example, if he worked for 10 years as a brakeman, in all honesty, he is going to be missing one or more of his fingers. So he also, not only did he have to worry about breaking his neck by falling off of a moving train, which he might do, the more likely thing is he's going to be missing one or more of his fingers because they're going to get caught in that link and pin, and it's just going to rip it off the top. So pretty gruesome stuff. Again, looking at your reactions, I can kind of see. And honestly, one of the tricks of the trade back in the day was a hiring manager, a train master perhaps, or a overseer would say to a brakeman, and brakeman walks into his office and says, I want a job. Oh, and what do you want to ask? Brakeman, you got any experience? Oh, I've worked for Santa Fe or the Southern Pacific for 10 years, 12 years. And the next thing the guy would ask, he'd say, hold up your hands. Hold them up like this. And I'm going to hang on a second here. So these brakemen, the hiring manager would hold his hands up and say, hold your hands up, and he'd look and he'd count. And if he had all 10 digits, the brakeman was a liar. It was that simple. The last thing that a brakeman had to do, and it was also very dangerous as well, is that bearings would catch on fire. Axles, these train axles will turn in grease, and it's a cheap grease, and it's a cheap bearing or an inefficient bearing system. As you should know, as metal parts turn, they create friction and heat, so you've got to grease them up. And so these bearing fires would catch on, and most of these old box cars and these old trains were made of wood. So anyways, they'd catch on fire. And so it was the job of the brakeman to hang over and try to put that fire out while the train's moving before anything got worse, and occasionally he'd get knocked off by another one of those limbs. It's a hard job. It's a hard job. Now, the next thing you need to make note of, and this is something I brought up just a few minutes ago, is about if you want a job and you want to be paid well, you better have a skill. It's not enough to have, for at least good pay, it's not enough to have strong or willing hands and a strong back. The best paid man on the railroad is going to be the engineer, as far as at least the train crew is concerned. The best paid man on the train crew is the engineer. He's the guy that pulls the throttle. The boss of the train crew is not the engineer, that is the conductor, and he's often paid less than his subordinate. So there's a friction right there. By the way, please put this in your notes. The first business or the first corporations or set of corporations, the first big industry to get unionized is the railroad because of how hard and nasty it was. The engineers themselves were paid fabulously well because they had skills, number one, and they had a good union backing them as well. I want you to think of an engineer much like that of a fighter pilot. And so I'm going to ask, and I'm going to put the recording on pause for just a second again. But in the 19th century, think about what most men did for a living. They were farmers still. And that's what you got to remember. In the 19th century, you're still dealing with a lot of Americans being farmers. More and more moving to the city. We'll get to that. But what do you do when you're a farmer? How boring is it to be a farmer, potentially? I mean, you follow a mule, and he breaks the land, and he pisses you off, and he smells his farts. Kind of be crude about it, I know, but the thing is that it's everybody can do that in a sense. But very few can pull the throttle and do the trains and such. That is the ego trip that a lot of those men have. Put this man's name in your notes. Tiny Evans. I know that man. I knew that man. He's dead now. Tiny Evans. Now, Tiny Evans is the name, or his nickname was Tiny. He was about 6'5", and when I knew him, he was about 6'3" because he was 85 and had shrunk. But Tiny Evans was a railroader of the first order. He was a proud engineer. That man had no compunction about telling you, I am an engineer. I drove the train. It was that same sort of ego that you found elsewhere, like with my cousin, who is a fighter pilot. He's got it in spades. But all that to say, though, is that Tiny Evans was also, put this in your notes as well, a very, very, very proud union man. It's hard to underscore and hard to overemphasize to you how important the union was to those men who worked in the railroad. The brakemen had their own unions, the firemen had their own unions, the engineers had their own unions, the conductors, and on I could go. But that was very unionized, and it was a very hard job. And so these men were very proud to be in the union, very proud to have gotten union benefits. It's worth saying is that Tiny Evans, he told me this story, and he and I were Masons together when he was living. That's where I met him through the Masonic Lodge. It was in Somerville, and a lot of those old railroaders were Masons, so that's where I came into him. He was about 85, 86 when he told me the story. And we were talking around probably about 12, 15 years ago at this point in time, and I had just probably started teaching, probably about 04, 05 territory, and we were discussing being in the railroad, and he said, quite frankly, he's like, yeah, I was an engineer. I'm an engineer, okay? And I find railroading interesting, and Dad loves it. And we started asking him questions and this and that, and this conversation wandered now to a strike. You know what a strike is, right? A strike is when the labor union, in this case the engineers or some other craft union, go out on strike for higher wages, shorter work hours or something, whatever it was. And this is in the 1940s. It may have been, thinking back in the time frame, it probably would have been about 1947 or so, 1948, right after World War II. And this is up at the city of Temple, Texas. So you might as well put that in your notes. Temple, Texas. And when it comes to Tiny Evans, he said there was a strike breaker. He called him a scab. He said this strike breaker had crossed the Union line, had broke the line, and he went to work for the Santa Fe Railroad at Temple. And then when the strike was over, Evans said the man hired on and stayed on with the railroad, with the Santa Fe. To say the least, he was a strike breaker, and so he was not welcome in the union, so he was a non-union employee. The way the residency in Temple is, and Temple's a railroad town, the way that the residential sections lay out, the tracks are kind of sunk down below the neighborhoods. And Tiny said that he had seen this man walk home the same way every day, walk along the tracks, kind of secluded portions at times. Then Tiny promptly told me, he said, me and Joe, he didn't say any more about the guy's name, just said, me and Joe, we caught him one day as he was walking home. And Tiny told me this story with not a least amount of regret. He said, we caught him when he walked home. And then we got him down, and we stretched his arm out over top of the rail, and then I took a hammer and broke his arm. There's a couple of you looking at me like, what on earth did he do that for? And the answer was, they broke his arm because he broke the union line. You break the union, there's a price to be paid. And so I want you to understand is that, especially if you grew up in Texas where labor unions are not nearly as strong as they are in Michigan or Wisconsin or in the old Rust Belt or other parts of the United States. But still, even in Texas, in the right industry, you can find these fiercely proud union boys who basically say, we won't brook any strike breakers. There's none of that live and let live stuff. It was a hard job. I talk about the Brakeman as being a hard particular job, but put this in your notes. What is the normal workload of a railroader? How long does he work during a day? What's a shift? I imagine some of you probably have worked an 8-hour shift. Some of you might have worked a 10-hour shift, maybe even a 12 or 13-hour shift if you were, say, restauranting or something like that. The railroad, the way it worked in the early days was they called you to work and they sent you home when they sent you home. So your shift could be 5 hours, 8 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours, maybe even 72 hours. So that's going to cause some problems. And if you said, well, I've got rights, you can't make me work that long, they're like, get out of here. But you also can imagine, too, this is why you're going to have so many accidents and you're going to have so many people killed on the railroad each year, is because of the issue of safety. So if I was to ask you the question, what was the first thing that the unions asked for in the railroad, in their negotiations? Was it more money, better benefits, blah, blah, blah? Not really. It seems to be that more often than not, in the early days of the union railroad tussling over rights and contracts, the thing was, we want less work hours. We don't want to be out there for 25 hours a day or 30 hours a day sort of thing. So it was less work hours. Then the money and the benefits come later. But yeah, it was unsafe work conditions. And there's other safety improvements as well. In fact, actually, to say this more correctly, the labor unions were the railroad unions were the first unions to receive federal protection. The railroad unions received federal protection, the first ones to get it. And so you'll see the 16-hour rule and the 12-hour rule come in the 20th century. So all that to say is that it is some tough stuff. It's also mythologized. Just kind of like as I talked about Top Gun just a second ago, The fact is that you're going to have songs written about engineers and railroads. You're going to have ballads and stories and stuff. It's a romantic thing. You get to go places. And so I want to close today's lecture with this last story, and it's called, for your notes, The Crash at Crush. The Crash at Crush. So the Crash at Crush takes place in 1896, September, as I recall, 1896. The Crash at Crush is a staged collision. Now, by 1896, railroads had become boogeymen. Railroads had become public enemy number one, according to some who had observed, and said basically one of the things, the crying need of America, was the correction and more particularly the capture of railroads and put under the federal government's tutelage. That in essence, the railroads like the Union Pacific or the Southern Pacific or all those railroads would need to be actually run by Washington, D.C. That was the Pope in the prayer. But a lot of people disliked railroads even though they had to have them. And so the Katy Railroad, Katy, K-A-T-Y, and when we talk about the Katy Railroad, Katy, Texas is kind of named for that railroad, by the way. So those of you who come from Katy or know people who do come from Katy, there you go. The Katy Railroad was a third-string railroad in the Southwest and the southeastern United States. It is a third-string railroad, kind of like Dodge trucks are. So if any of you have got a Dodge truck, you know what I'm talking about. Cheaper interior, more prone to failure, plastic, cracked dash, back seat about as hard as a park bench. All those wonderful things about the joys of Dodge ownership, found on the road dead, etc. That means Ford, excuse me. Sorry about that. But the fact of the matter is that Dodges have a well-earned reputation for being, well, just being Dodges. Or they're not Rams. I know what they are, but they're Dodges. And so I crack on them, and I say that, and I even have a Ram truck. So, call me a hypocrite if you want, I guess. But the thing is that the Katy Railroad, the reason I say that, their accommodations were always more shabby. Their lines heading into various Texas cities or other cities was always long, and so they had to wiggle around. They never had a straight line. They always took longer. It just was not so good. But they were looking to drum up support and drum up business. Enter in your notes the name George Crush, the namesake of Crush, Texas. George Crush. George Crush was the marketing manager of the Katy Railroad. George Crush is going to hit upon this idea of creating this staged collision where you take two old, ready for mothballs, ready for the scrap heap, old engines and their trains, and you ram them together in the middle of an open field. Who wouldn't want to see that? I mean, even to this day, we still have demolition derbies, don't we? I mean, Houston has plenty of demolition derbies. Dallas does Sunday, Sunday, Sunday sort of thing. But when it comes to it, people in the 19th century were no different. They wanted to see it. And so the Katy Railroad establishes for one day only a city called Crush, Texas, out just north and west of Waco, Texas. And these trains that are going to be in the Crash at Crush are going to travel all over Oklahoma and Arkansas and Louisiana and Texas, and they are going to promote this railroad and this demolition. And oh, by the way, you can buy a cheap ticket, $5, and you can go to the Crush, Texas, and spend a weekend in beautiful Waco watching two trains crash into each other. Who wouldn't want to do that? I would. Well, maybe not, but there could be some problems with this whole idea, though. So Laura's thinking, this might not be safe. And so she's like, no, it might not be safe. What could go wrong if you crash two steam engines into each other? Oh, you're saying, could the boilers explode? Yes, that could be a major pterodactyl in the old ointment. So when we talk about these boilers exploding, George Crush does not want to kill customers. That's probably not good for business. So Crush goes to the various old mechanics, young and old alike mechanics on the Katy Railroad, and he says to them, if we ram these engines into each other, will the boilers explode? And I think he talked to like 41 engineers, 41 mechanics. And these mechanics, to the man, except for one, said, nothing to worry about. Just make sure people are back from flying debris and that sort of thing. You'll be okay. Keep them a safe distance. Everything will be kosher. It'd be good. And so, who do you listen to, the 40 or the 1? There was one old mechanic said, "You're a damned fool. You're going to get a bunch of people killed." Who do you listen to, the 40 or the 1? Of course you listen to the 40 because money's at stake. And so, the crash at Crush is on. There were several thousand people at that little town. People had come in from the countryside to see the crash at Crush. There was a post office that day, so you could send friends and family postcards saying, "I was here at the crash at Crush." There was a telegraph operator to describe the events to people at a distance. And then, of course, you had photographers, you'd have politicians giving speeches, you had food, you had bands. I mean, it was a hoopla affair. And at 5 o'clock in the afternoon on the day of the event, a Sunday afternoon, the two trains come together and they touch cow catchers like so, like they're shaking hands. And then they back away. One train goes 1.5 miles one way, and the other train goes 1.5 miles the other direction. At 5 o'clock, the signal, if they when they get to their points, the signal is given, and the two trains, the throttles are thrown wide open, and away we go. There is a point of no return at about 3/4 of a mile out. The thinking was we could stop the trains if we had to at 3/4, but once that's past 3/4, the engineer bails and he jumps off the train and it's on, and there's no turning back. So the crowd is in a frenzy. Everybody's excited. The photographer specially hired to take the photo that you could get as a memento of the great crash at Crush is sitting there taking his photos. And then you can see that last one right as the trains come together, and you can see them start to rise up. And if you look close, I swear you can see some of the rivets coming off of the boiler jacket as they're exploding as well. Then, the split second after that photographer took that last photo, he catches a bolt in the eye, and he puts his eye out. The jackets and the boilers explode. Shrapnel is flying everywhere. I mean, this is like an artillery burst had just gone off. To a man standing next to his wife and a woman underneath a tree just sitting there talking, just observing at a safer distance than what had been laid out. He had his head turned into a canoe by the fact is that by flying shrapnel. 3 people were killed that day, hundreds maimed. So you're thinking to yourself, what happens next? What would you do if your family member, your beloved, was there and maimed or killed at the crash at Crush? And some of you are saying, Hussein's like, man, I'm calling a lawyer tomorrow. He's lawyering up. He's going to sue the pants off the Katy Railroad. Well, George Crush, first of all, was fired that day. He was rehired the next day. And next, the better part is that thousands of people sued the Katy Railroad. But the rest of the story is this. The Katy Railroad settled out of court with almost all of them. And they gave them either a lump sum payment or more often than not, the Katy Railroad gave these survivors or the plaintiffs, they gave them 2 tickets of lifetime ridership on the Katy Railroad. So for the rest of your life, you could ride the Katy Railroad wherever you wanted to go. And remember, in 1896, you don't have planes and trains yet. You don't have planes yet. So they don't know that's coming. And then last but not least, you may say, was the ridership down on the Katy Railroad? No. No such thing as bad publicity, folks. Ridership in the Katy Railroad went up noticeably the next couple of years because of the crash at Crush. So anyways, that's the first of 2 lectures on railroads. You're going to learn them, and you're going to get more about railroads than you ever thought possible, at least from a survey class in history. So I hit my stop button right now.